Please welcome Joe Macleod.
Hey, Circularity 21, thanks ever so much for inviting me there. Sorry I can't be there in person, but I am certainly there in spirit. Um, I'd like to talk to you today about the consumer offboarding experience. And I phrase that as called engineering. So let's talk about it. We can broadly define the experience, the consumer life cycle, into three stages. That's onboarding, usage, and offboarding. And if we put that onto a map of engagement, we can see as the consumer graduates into an experience, a consumer experience, they're attracted through advertising, marketing, these very meaningful type of experiences towards being a customer in usage. And at that point, after a while, they might want to leave that relationship. So they try and leave. But actually, we've designed very little about offboarding in the same way. That's a barren, emotionless place, often put up by society, takes on the responsibility, and then the environment often gets the impact of that. So we haven't designed offboarding experiences. Endings seem to be very quick and meaningless, or some linger on forever in our homes and houses. And in other cases, sometimes we're not really allowed to leave in certain things. But let me give you an example of what I mean by an offboarding experience with printer ink cartridges. My printer runs out of ink every 5 minutes, it seems, and I go out, I buy a new printer ink cartridge, and I take the old one out, put the new one in, and then I'm standing there holding an old printer ink cartridge thinking, what shall I do with this? I can't throw it in landfill. It's super toxic, despite 60 to 90% of these do end up in landfill every year. But I look on the back of the package and thinking there'd be some direction, instruction there. There's two other marketing messages there, onboarding experiences. So, well, what do I do with this in terms of offboarding it safely into the proper place? I scramble around online. Actually, I find out there's a company been doing this for 20 odd years, this company, and I don't know about it in this context. But I do find out if I fill in some of the forms, they'll send me envelope, and I put this printer ink cartridge in the envelope, then send it back to them via the post office. Probably takes another couple of days to get back to them. So it's taken like 5 days to offboard this experience. It was hidden from me, the consumer, and I had to do loads of extra effort to work out what to do properly so it doesn't end up in landfill, in toxic, and damage the environment. This is going on everywhere, this lack of offboarding experiences. But I thought it was the result of some sort of hard-nosed business logic. Actually, when you really dig into this issue, it's been framed over centuries. Ever since the 14th century, we've been framing how we've got rid of endings as an experience in our society. So think about pre-industrial Europe, 14th century, and we start telling that story here. So imagine it. Life is super hard, impoverished. There's lots of disease around. And you're probably very familiar with this subject, death. You see death as a next simple part of life, and you definitely want to get to this place, heaven, which is somewhere after death. So to do that, you have to follow certain rule structures, one of which is getting out of life, i.e. having a funeral in the proper manner. And the trouble is, all of that organisation is totally disrupted when the plague arrives in 1347, decimates Europe. Within 3 years, Europe's population has been killed by a third. And that means death becomes very meaningless and people stop believing in all those things. The dominant religion at the time, the Catholic religion, really mismanaged it. Lots of their priests and service personnel were dying. New challenger religions came along, one of which was the Protestants under Martin Luther. Now, they had some different views of how we should live our lives. And these three new views sort of laid a foundation of consumerism and our relationship with endings. The first one was fasting. Now, fasting is a skill in many religions where the whole community of the religion removes themselves from the abundance of life and then reflects upon it as a group. Martin Luther removed this very early on in the Protestant religion, and with that, that removed the opportunity to reflect on abundance and how lucky we are. And imagine how useful that skill would be in consumerism today, reflection. The second thing was jobs. It changed our attitude towards jobs with the Protestants. So in the Catholic religion, there was three jobs: a priest, the Pope, a priest, and a nun, and all other jobs were very lowly. But in the Protestant religion, if you'd done any job, if done well with thought and care, it was considered a good job in the eyes of God. This changed our ideas about purpose in life and to the passion that we have careers now. It's the beginning of career paths. And lastly, investment in the eyes of God changed in the Protestants. And this is all going on pre-industrial times in Northern Europe. But let's look at this period through the eyes of the consumer. So splitting the consumer experience out. So imagine the waste and the idea around waste and consumption. So in pre-industrial times, this was quite a simple idea. The waste from the kitchen table would go to the animals. The waste from the animals would go onto the land. And the abundance and harvest from the land would come back onto the kitchen table. It was a circle of consumption. And with that, after the Industrial Revolution, we changed it into a linear narrative. And that's a similar story to the circular economy story, that we need to move back to the circularity thing. But what we're missing is the consumer experience of this, because the consumer experience got totally split in half over this period. Now, the consumer onboarding experience got very sophisticated, rich, and very fast. So we sort of had these things like department stores and really sophisticated advertising and marketing. But on the other side, we got rid of these relationships with waste in terms of like germs, and we tell that story again and again. With things like climate change, it's become distant, irrelevant for consumers to acknowledge climate change. It becomes this sort of thing that only scientists can see and understand. And we also do these things like create the Dixie cup, which was the first disposable cup. So endings become instant, distant, and faded. And this has created a psychosis in all of us, where one side of us is a really good consumer, very sophisticated understanding of consumerism, and the other side is this civil person who's very anxious about consumerism, very anxious about pollution, etc. But these two individuals in all of us never get this opportunity to meet inside the consumer life cycle, and we've got to correct that. And let's come back to circularity for a minute. So the ideal of the circularity in a circular life cycle is between the consumer life cycle on one side and industrial life cycle on another, and that's great, and it's a self-feeding prophecy. But what's really going on is we talk about all other aspects of it, but we very much forget the consumer experience. The consumer experience, don't forget, is driving the onboarding all the time in very passionate, sophisticated way. And we've got this enormous gap at offboarding in the consumer life cycle that is barren of emotion and meaning, which means the consumer ends up being abandoned, uninstructed. And this is where the damage and the chaos is starting to get there. So there's this gap at the end which is emerging. So let's think about this gap. This gap is a big problem, and it's the consumer offboarding experience. And there's four characteristics in this gap. The first one is that the relationship breaks, and in that breakage, the assets from that relationship fall to the feet of society. The second thing is asset definition is lost. So as a consumer throws something into the waste stream, the definition of that waste, that item, which was very rich and meaningful to the consumer, instantly becomes neutralized not neutralized, but it becomes irrelevant in terms of its identity. and that's a big problem in terms of consumers' understanding of boarding. And the actors and actions are anonymized. So the identity of the provider and the consumer, as the consumer throws things into the waste stream or removes something into the waste stream, their identity is removed and relinquishes them of any relationship with this thing, which is a big problem in consumerism, and it means that consumers can't get engaged in this stuff. And lastly, routes to neutralizing become blurred for the consumer at offboarding. So simple things like biological matter, like for an apple, for example, that erodes, consumers understand that. But as soon as we get into very simple product materials like a plastic bag, that becomes increasingly complicated with infinite possibilities going on thereafter. And we need to correct that at consumer offboarding. So let's talk about the consumer life cycle for a moment. There's a load of stuff that I do around engineering and designing consumer offboarding experiences. These are 8 types of endings that consumers commonly experience in the offboarding, the consumer life cycle at the end. Now, these are really important to start designing around instead of the sort of passive things that we're designing for consumers at the end of the consumer life cycle currently. We also need to think of phases because the consumer goes through certain experience phases that we need to start thinking about so we can grab hold of damaging materials and neutralize them in collaboration with the consumer offboarding. And lastly, I just want to finish on this. What we really need to do is build engineering experiences that should be consciously connected to the rest of the experience through emotional triggers, similar to advertising, that are actionable so the consumer can get inside and start really playing with these things and doing something about it. And these need to be done in a timely manner so we don't have houses full up with old products, or so we get these things out of those ecosystems and back into being neutralized properly with a provider, because we have to start designing consumer offboarding experiences. They're so critical. Thank you very much. Bye bye. And this is the book that's on Amazon, and follow me on all sorts of other platforms and keep up with stuff. And there's also courses I run on engineering, so you can check them out on Eventbrite. Thank you very much.